Man thought he found a puppy in the forest, then vet calls the police. When Jonathan found a very weak-looking black puppy in the forest, his first instinct was to bring it to a local vet to help it out. But he would soon realize that this was a big mistake. He was not dealing with a puppy at all and should have just left it right where he found it. The reaction from the vet had made Jonathan even more sure about his suspicions. He had not rescued a puppy from the forest. This was something very different, and he was about to get the confirmation he was looking for. The vet came back out of the office, but he did not have the little black creature with him. He looked concerned when he put a hand on Jonathan's shoulder and told him, "I know it's not your fault, but you made a big mistake." Jonathan's jaw dropped as the vet started explaining himself. All he had wanted to do was help this poor animal, but he should have just left it alone. But what kind of animal did Jonathan rescue from the forest, and why would it have been better if he had just left it there alone? Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell. Let's proceed with the video. Jonathan has been an animal lover for as long as he can remember. Today wouldn't be the first time he was on a rescue mission for an animal in need. He loved nature and would often walk through the woods, and like so many other times, today was a day he'd be a helper to an animal in need. But things aren't what they seem. Jonathan thought he'd seen it all. After all, he'd rescued dozens of animals, from birds to rodents, lost dogs and cats, and something resembling a wild boar. He didn't like to be called a hero, but deep down it felt good to help these animals. After all, they were so cute and lovable. How could he refuse to help an animal in need? He was pretty skilled at helping animals. He could identify basic problems and knew a few vets in the city. This also meant he felt pretty confident in his skills at identifying animals, but this time would be different. The most important problem at hand was the baby animal all alone, but the trouble would start soon. While on one of Jonathan's walks through the woods outside of the city, he was sure he heard an animal crying for help. He paused in the woods, waiting to hear it again. It was only a few seconds until he heard the cry again. It was faint, but it was there, and most of all, it sounded like a puppy. But how did a puppy get way out here? Jonathan was determined to find the lost puppy. Listening to the cries and taking careful, soft steps, he made his way through the forest. He thought he'd lost the puppy at one point when the crying stopped. Frightened he'd gone too far, Jonathan took a few steps back until he once again heard the soft crying. It was then that he spotted the little thing. There was a small bed of moss, and laying on top of it was a little black puppy, so young that its eyes hadn't fully opened yet. Jonathan leaned over the poor creature and looked around for other possible puppies. After all, they usually came in bunches, but there was nothing. Jonathan spent a few minutes looking over the little creature, trying to see if it had any wounds of any kind. The puppy seemed fine except for being alone and probably scared, but was it a puppy? The more he looked at it, Jonathan wasn't sure, and that wasn't the only odd thing here. The little moss bed that held the supposed puppy was strange and looked odd to Jonathan. This wasn't something very likely to be found in nature. Perhaps some animal had built it as a sort of nest? But still, an animal would be messier. This left one very confusing and possibly terrifying conclusion. If it hadn't been an animal and it wasn't natural, that left one possibility: humans. The big question was, why would someone come out to the middle of the woods and leave a baby puppy all alone, and was it even a puppy? Jonathan had a lot of questions and no answers, but he knew one thing had to be done. Making a makeshift carrier for the tiny animal out of the cover of his travel bag, he carefully put the puppy inside it. He still had a lot of walking left to go before he'd reach his car, but at least for now the little thing would be safe and protected from any nasty animals around. Jonathan repeatedly checked on the puppy as he walked back to his car. It was threatening to rain, and Jonathan didn't want the little baby to get wet or a chill, but the more he looked at the animal, the more curious he got. While he had suspicions of it not being a puppy, he was almost sure now. So what was it? The black creature was small and definitely a baby, so it didn't have any distinctive features. It was really too young to tell what it was, but the face looked odd enough. It'd have to be some kind of crossbreed for it to have a face like that. He couldn't think of any other explanation. It wasn't until further on his walk that Jonathan had another idea. Maybe the animal wasn't native to this forest or area. A puppy wouldn't be native to around here, but at least it would make a bit more sense if the animal wasn't native to this area. How'd it get here? Again, the only plausible answer was humans. It didn't really matter what the creature was, Jonathan was going to look after it and get it the help it needed. A shelter would probably take the puppy, but it needed to be seen by a vet first. The city was a half-hour's drive away. Jonathan hoped the creature would be okay. Until then it was getting darker out. After another few minutes, Jonathan finally reached the parking lot. It didn't take him longer than 2 seconds to figure out something was very, very wrong. The parking lot was completely empty. There wasn't anyone there. That would be normal with the rain coming in, but his car was missing too. Recovering himself, Jonathan walked over to where he was sure he parked it. Thinking he could be wrong, he took a quick walk around the lot and searched for his car. It couldn't have been towed. He'd parked it right here in this lot that was perfectly legal. He went back to the first spot and found a single clue. Bending down to the pavement, Jonathan found a lot of broken glass, small fragments that he had missed earlier. It was evident now that someone had broken into his car and stolen it. They'd had both the time and opportunity. How was he supposed to get back to the city now, and with rain rolling in? The park where he'd been walking wasn't well known and was off of a fairly quiet road. Lucky for him, Jonathan still has his phone and some battery. He decided to call the police first to report his car being stolen. The baby animal in his pack was important, but right now his car took priority. Jonathan told the police what kind of car he had, the make, the model, where it had been, the license plate, and anything else he thought was important. The police told him they'd keep an eye out for it, but that was all they could do for now. He thanked them and hung up. That was done, but he was still stranded. He thought about getting to his apartment in the city, but the little creature in his pack still needed attention. He needed to get to the vet's first and then go home. Unfortunately, the vet's office was in the city, still a half-hour away, and now he didn't even have a car. But in today's world it couldn't be that hard to get a ride, right? Jonathan checked the Uber app first. No one was willing to drive that far out of the city to come and pick him up. Jonathan was willing to pay the price for a ride, but no one was interested. Jonathan tried a taxi service next. He explained his situation, but they told him no too. They were worried it was a scam to rob them and their drivers. This didn't stop Jonathan yet. In a city that big, there were several taxi companies, but he lost hope as service after service turned him down. Jonathan was furious after the 6th company refused him. He was desperate, and it was starting to sprinkle rain now. He didn't want to stay in the cold. It was time for something drastic. He was going to hitchhike. While there weren't many cars that came down this road, one would have to come eventually. It was just a matter of time. Thankfully for him, he only had to wait about 10 minutes before a car came turning around the bend. Jonathan thanked his lucky stars and went to work. Jonathan flagged down the car, and once he had their attention, put out his thumb showing he needed a ride. A middle-aged woman rolled down the window of her car. Jonathan explained what had happened to him, that his car had been stolen and he needed a ride into the city. Would she believe him? As luck would have it, she was indeed heading to the city as well and had no problem picking up Jonathan to go with her. She seemed kind enough and believed his story. He sat down in the passenger seat, and from the moment he sat down he heard a curious noise coming from the backseat of the car. Jonathan sat up, his mind on the animal that was cradled in his arms next to him. The woman's Labrador approached the bundle, slowly sniffing around it to figure out what was hidden inside. At first Jonathan thought the dog had smelled a puppy and its motherly instinct had kicked in, but he quickly realized how wrong he was. Jonathan smiled at the bigger dog. Loosening his grip on the bundle that covered the puppy, he allowed the Labrador to come closer to the bundle. The Labrador was calm, and this led Jonathan to believe that the bigger dog would not pose a threat. Opening up the covers to reveal the puppy to the Labrador, Jonathan watched in horror as things got worse. Jonathan only realized his mistake once it was too late. The Labrador took a peek at the puppy and sniffed the tiny animal for a second before suddenly growing alarmingly aggressive. The Labrador began to growl, showing her teeth, before quickly getting reprimanded for her behavior by her owner. Jonathan stared in horror, before turning away from the bigger dog, who was still visibly upset at the presence of the puppy. Jonathan sighed out in frustration. It was becoming very clear that the animal he had picked up in the forest was definitely not a puppy. What the hell had he done? Jonathan closed his eyes as he silently hoped that a vet would be able to shed some light on the situation. Nodding his head, he stared straight with a determined look. There was a change of plans. He would be heading to a vet first. It was clear now that figuring out the animal's identity would need to take priority. Luckily, the lady was kind enough to drop him off. They arrived at the vet's shortly after the lady wished him luck and left him in front of the building. After checking in at the front desk, Jonathan sat in the waiting room keeping the tiny creature nestled into the bundle to avoid agitating the other animals in the office. He did, however, show the animal to the receptionist, who was just as lost as Jonathan. She informed Jonathan that she would be bumping him up the list because the animal looked to be in very bad shape and she didn't want its presence to upset the other animals. Even with that information, Jonathan was shocked when he heard his name being called only a few minutes later. Jonathan held the animal in his hand and the vet directed him towards a chair. He narrated the events that had occurred in the forest to the vet, who listened closely and took notes. Occasionally the vet would ask questions, but the meeting only lasted about 10 minutes before Jonathan was asked to head back into the waiting room. Now that the baby animal was in the care of the vet, Jonathan could turn his focus to other important matters. For one, the theft of his car. Jonathan called the police to report the theft of his car and was shocked to hear that he would need to be transferred to another department. Thankfully, this was because they had found his car. Apparently the thief had rode into town with the broken window and a police officer spotted the vehicle and stopped it for a routine check. When the driver could not provide his information, the thief and the car were taken into custody and Jonathan had called in moments later. Jonathan was surprised to hear all his information, but he was glad things had wrapped up well on that end. There were still a few steps he needed to take to have the car released to him. Not to mention his insurance, but before he got a chance he felt someone frantically tap his shoulder. It was the vet. Jonathan apologized to the cops and hung up. He was a bit confused by the intense look the doctor bore on his face, but soon his curiosity would be answered. "I know it's not your fault, but you made a big mistake bringing this animal in here." Jonathan felt his heart sink. Jonathan's defeated look would grow even deeper as the doctor explained what was going on. It turns out the young animal was indeed in a grave situation and there was nothing the doctor could do for it now that the illness had progressed. However, that wasn't the worst part. In its current state, the animal posed a great danger to the other animals in the clinic. The doctor explained that the animal was infected with an incredibly contagious virus to smaller mammals. Not only was it very contagious, it was also a near-fatal infection when not caught on time, which was the case of the baby raccoon Jonathan had found. Jonathan's eyes rounded in surprise before his brows peaked in interest. A raccoon? He almost laughed at the situation. His suspicions had indeed been right and he was in fact not dealing with a puppy after all, but he truly would have never guessed the baby animal was a raccoon. The vet continued to explain. The virus the raccoon was infected with was well known to the vet, who had been studying it for the past few weeks. It was recently widely reported in the area, and although it was most common amongst raccoons, rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, etc., were all prone to catching it, Jonathan was wary. What had he done? The doctor calmed him quickly. He explained that they had already isolated the raccoon at the back of the shop. However, both the vet and Jonathan would need a new set of clothes and a shower to prevent spreading the virus to other animals. Luckily for Jonathan and the staff of the clinic, there was no risk of contracting the virus as humans are immune to it. This made Jonathan feel a lot better, but the doctor explained that even after the shower protocol was that the other animals would need to be tested for safety. A few hours later, all the tests were done. The doctor stepped back out and announced that all the animals had tested negative. Sadly, the baby raccoon situation only worsened as the time went by, and shortly after it passed away. The day was strange and eventful, and Jonathan still finds his mind drifting to it often. In hindsight, it was clear that he should have left the baby raccoon in the forest, but in that moment abandoning a baby animal had not seemed like the right thing to do. And even now he was glad he had made the choice to try and save it in the end. Doing his best to help anyone in need was part of what made him who he was, and he was proud about it. What did you think of this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video and subscribe. See you next time.